Hello, friends, and welcome to my presentation for EDU 534, History of Western Education, with Dr. Amber Durr at the University of Mary. My name is Father Robert Whitney. I'm a priest of the Archdiocese of Anchorage, Juneau, and I'm currently working on doctoral studies through the University of Mary in education and Catholic studies. I'm going to just give a brief overview of my final paper for the course, which is related to my doctoral work, and that is on the educational thought of Dr. John Sr., the title of which is The Long-Sighted View, Themes from the Pedagogical Vision of Dr. John Sr. John Sr. Was an American educator and intellectual who was born in 1923 and died in 1999, so relatively recent, and has been considered by some to be one of the greatest American intellectuals, American Catholic intellectuals ever. And First Things and Ignatius Insight performed a poll in which he was in one of the top 10 greatest American Catholic intellectuals. And he was a student of the famous Mark Van Doren, one of the greatest teachers to go through Columbia, taught there for many years, and Sr., along with Thomas Merton and others, were students of Van Doren's. And it was there that he really began his intellectual journey, if you will, in academia. But even before that, you can see the roots of his thinking in his own experiences in life. In particular, when he was a young kid, he ran off to be a cowboy, and actually ran away from home. And he went to the Dakota Badlands and became basically a ranch hand, and continued to do that for some of his summers. And this had a really formative influence on his philosophical vision, which would undergird his educational vision, and that is the philosophy of realism. Realism is sometimes called the perennial philosophy, the idea that the real is really real, as Senior put it. That there's nothing in the intellect which wasn't first in the senses, that everything we know comes through the senses as a media, and that's how we come to know things. This would be called by people like Aristotle the abstraction, where we abstract the forms in our minds, and we can know things in their essence in this way. So from Plato to Aristotle, all the way up until modernity, really beginning with Descartes, people in general thought that their minds were at least reasonably effective thinking instruments, and that our senses could be trusted. And so again, this is called the perennial philosophy, or the philosophy of realism, and this is one of Senior's kind of most important educational underpinnings for his own personal philosophy. And again, it began really at that young age when he was experiencing reality as a cowboy. There's a great quotation that I like to share. One of my favorite Senior quotes about that experience as a cowboy in the Dakota Badlands. And he says this: "The immediate practical purpose of drinking a cup of coffee is to wash the biscuit down. Its proximate ethical purpose is the intimate communion of, say, cowboys. They do exist." Well, James was right. "Standing around the solemn campfire in a drenching rain, water curling off Stetsons over slickers, splashing on the rowels of spurs as they draw the bitter liquid down their several throats into the single moral belly of their comradeship. The remote political purpose of coffee at the campfire is the making of Americans. Born on the frontier, free, frank, friendly, touchy about honor, despisers of fences, lovers of horses, worshippers of eagles and women. The ultimate purpose is spiritual. For a boy to drink a can of coffee with cowboys in the rain is, as Odysseus said of Alcinous's banquet, something like perfection." Really great passage from Senior that really does kind of illustrate how realism, the philosophy of realism, would affect his pedagogical vision. A senior, again, he did study under Van Doren and studied the great books and in a comparative literature course. And this would help him to grow to love poetry and beauty and see the objective value in such things, and would lead him to really form his own vision for education and what it is, what it's really all about, what it's for. He actually said in a talk he gave in Laramie in Wyoming in 1967 for an honors banquet, he said, "What is the use of education? It's no use at all unless you have it and share it. If you want to teach English, you must have in you the habit of grammar and the love of poetry. Education is an aspect of culture, and culture is an organic growth, or as we call it, a tradition. It is a knowledge handed down. The Latin root of the word is trado, I hand down, from generation to generation, mother to child, teacher to student. And quite obviously, you cannot hand down what has not been handed down to you." And so tradition and culture are really the reason we have education at all, to pass on culture, Western culture especially, with its delight in poetry. And he very much saw the educational process as a vertical process. And he said, philosophy, Aristotle said, begins in wonder, and poetry, Robert Frost, begins in delight and ends in wonder. Put those two fine sentences together, written over 2,000 years apart, and you have the use of education. Poetry begins in the open, everyday experience of delight in the things of the world, and ends in wonder. Philosophy begins where poetry leaves off, that is, in wonder, and it ends in truth. And so this is really the process of coming to know things. And really, it's going to be about making saints, very much in the line of Cardinal Newman, who was a great hero to John Senior. Cardinal Newman said, "It can never be too often repeated that the object, use of education, is to write the divine law upon the heart, right? To create in the breast of man a living witness to the truth of God." Senior would say very similar things when he talks about the importance of culture. Culture as an agriculture is the cultivation of the soil from which men grow. And he goes on to quote the Catechism about what is man. Man is made in the image and likeness of God, to know, love, and serve him. Culture, therefore, clearly has this simple end. No matter how complex or difficult the means, our happiness consists in a perfection that is no mere endless hedonistic whoosh through space and time, but the achievement of that definite love and knowledge which is final and complete. All the paraphernalia of our lives, intellectual, moral, social, psychological, and physical, has this end. Christian culture is the cultivation of saints. We'll hear this later on from Archbishop Miller, for example, in his wonderful little book, The Holy See's Teaching on Catholic Schools. The two most important books by Senior are these two, The Death and Restoration of Christian Culture. And if you were only to read one book by Senior, I'd recommend this short little book, The Restoration of Christian Culture, which includes some wonderful chapters on his pedagogical vision. But it can easily be summed up, and that is, again, it is about the cultivation, ultimately, of saints. And for my own particular studies, I would say my thesis, if you will, is that one of the things there's been very little written about Senior. There's one book on him, and that is John Senior and the Restoration of Realism by one of his former students, Father Prior Bethel. Many of his students became monks and priests, and one of I would say, the deficiency in the literature, as we would call it, is that it doesn't often talk about John Senior's vision for freedom. Mark Van Doren wrote a lot about freedom in his wonderful book on education. Liberal Education is the title of the book. And for Senior, it's more of an implicit part of his pedagogy. And there are several reasons for that, which I can't get into here. One of which is the very word freedom comes with all kinds of baggage, especially in modernity. And so he'll distinguish as, like a good Thomist, freedom for excellence versus a freedom of indifference. And we read this in people like Pinckaers is very good at this distinction, or Joseph Pieper, for example. But this is really going to be important for Senior, and even if he doesn't talk about it explicitly, as he does, for example, realism, freedom is very much a part of Senior's educational vision. It's really the use of education is to help us to become morally free and responsible, not only, of course, for life here on earth, which is fleeting, but ultimately with life in heaven. And so I'll leave you with this one great quote from one of Senior's poems from his little book of poetry, Pale Horse, Easy Rider. I think this is a fitting way to end. And again, just to keep in mind that the Senior's education, his educational vision, really blossomed at the University of Kansas in the 1970s, where he, with two colleagues, Dennis Quinn and Frank Nellick, started the Integrated Humanities Program. And it led to hundreds of conversions to the Catholic faith, even though they didn't proselytize at all. It simply encouraged that wonder in the world, that love of beauty, which would, of course, be delightful, but would also begin the journey to philosophy and ultimately help the mind to seek and desire after truth. And many of his former students became monks, founded Clear Creek Abbey in Oklahoma. A couple of them became bishops, in fact, Bishop Coakley and Bishop Conley, and many also went on to become teachers themselves and founded schools around the United States. So I'll leave you with the last two stanzas of his poem, Contemptus Mundi. Two ways to make contemptible the world. The first is not to look. The second, and more sensible, to read it like a book. To learn the grammar and the word, loving not the less, but more. Contemning it as music heard, supersedes the score. Thank you all so much for your kind attention, and I look forward to your charitable comments. God bless, and Merry Christmas.